I'll just tell you about, or our audience about the Daily Comparatists, which is organizing this webinar. Daily Comparatist is a group of scholars who have been trained in the models which were developed in the Department of Modern Indian Languages and Literary Studies, University of Delhi, primarily envisioned by Professor R.K. Dasgupta, the founder Tagore Professor of the department, and later, of course, used and nurtured by many other scholars, most importantly, Professor S.K. Das, whose history of Indian literature is known to us, and then Professor T.S. Satyanath, who has brought a turn so far as material and also looking at the material is concerned. So now as a group, we are more into comparative cultural studies, and Daily Comparatist is organizing many webinars and has undertaken many research projects. We have multiple subgroups, particularly there, of course, as you can assume, the COVID-19 cultural responses subgroup is working right now, working very fast, and we already had webinars. Today's meeting has been organized by our subgroup, which deals with diaspora and memory studies, of which Shrimoyee Chattopadhyay is the coordinator. We are also, from all the subgroups, we are trying to have lectures delivered by various scholars from different disciplines, or with the same disciplinary background, but their focus areas are different from what we usually do in cultural studies and literature studies. In that series, we had sociologists, biologists coming and speaking to us. Today, we have a speaker who, with the background in English studies, deals with an area which is not that common for literature students. We also have Dr. Parui, Dr. Abhishek Parui. I have listened to 2 of his lectures, and I think he is adding something, a new dimension, which we also get into. Our understanding of literary studies will also change. As chair, we have Professor Tapodhir Bhattacharya, Tapodhir sir, my teacher, who has changed the understanding of how to do literature for generations of students. He is a part of our department. He was a Tagore professor in our department. But most importantly, he has changed how we, for generations of, quite a few generations of students, have understood literature and going beyond what traditional literary disciplines offer us. Welcome to you, sir. Welcome, Abhishek. Now I'll request Shrimoyee to start the meeting with the introduction of the speaker and the chair. Thank you. Over to you, Shrimoyee.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Amitabh, for introducing Daily Comparatists. So as Amitabh said, there are several subgroups within this Daily Comparatists, and each one is like performing in the individual areas. This is the first time we are organizing a webinar on memory studies and diaspora. Delhi Comparatist is trying to organize the webinars that ensure dialogue between several disciplines, and it acts as a meeting ground for several scholars from different focused areas. We sincerely hope that the discussion we are going to have following the talk is going to add a new dimension. Therefore, I would not waste much time, and would like to introduce our chair, Dr. Tapodhir Bhattacharya. The former Vice Chancellor of Assam University, Dr. Bhattacharya has been granted Emeritus Fellowship by the University Grants Commission for his outstanding contribution in the field of Bengali literature. Through his academic career spanning over 5 decades, he has consistently dealt with literature and the theories from various linguistic cultures adding newer insights in our understanding of the contemporary cultural and literary theories. I would now like to welcome our speaker, Dr. Abhishek Parui. Dr. Parui has pursued his PhD from Durham University. He is an assistant professor in English at IIT-Madras and associate fellow of the UK Higher Education Academy. His research interests include memory studies, cognitive theory, masculinity studies, and critical theory. He is the author of Postmodern Literatures published by Orion Black Swan and is currently contracted with Rowman and Littlefield for his second book titled Culture and the Literary, Matter, Metaphor, Memory. He is the principal investigator of a project titled Sleepless Cities and is one of the faculty coordinator of the Memory Studies Research Network at IIT Madras. If I may request now our chair, Tapodhir sir, to please take over. Thank you so much.
This webinar, which is being organized by the Delhi competitors for quite some time now. Indeed, it has been a rousing call to all of us to reinvigorate cultural studies in general and understanding of our life. I will not confine myself within the span of literature, our life at large, to understand, to redecipher, and and also to make new placements to everything around. And the subject matter of today's deliberation is indeed very captivating. And I'm sure what we will trespass right now, the speaker would present and interrogate a new range of new theoretical discourses, and you'd prove a new understanding for all of us. And I look forward personally also to listen to him, because as I told you, he would be speaking of several emergent possibilities within the arena of cultural studies in general, and also the arena of comparative studies. And what right now my pupil, Dr. Amitabh Chakraborty, was was telling us, it would definitely add a new lease of life to what we now know as comparative study. In fact, in this 21st century, we are now coming to the end of the second decade of the new century, or the new millennium. And even we are talking of post theories these days, though it has been very severely argued for and against. Anyway, I'm sure now what the speaker, the very learned speaker, would tell us, it will breathe fresh intellectual life in the field of general literature in general, and understanding of our life around us in particular. With these words, I would not come in between the very expectant listeners and the learned speaker, and I would invite him now to deliver his very well wrought speech. So, Dr. Parui, please.
Thank you very much. I hope I'm audible to everyone. Thank you very much for the very generous and kind introduction, Professor Bhattacharya. It's always a special pleasure to meet someone from Assam University, because I started my career in IIT Guwahati in 2014. So it's a very special reconnect or remembering, if I may say so. Thanks very much to Delhi Comparators, excellent group. I think it's such a rich research cluster. And I'm looking forward to the interactions at the end of my presentation. Thank you, Shrimoyee. Thank you, Amitabh, for this opportunity, really, for me to present my work and also get some very valuable feedback, hopefully, at the end of it. Now, I'm really interested and intrigued to know that this particular session is being sort of designed by the Diaspora subcluster in this particular network, which is Delhi Comparators. So I'll just start with the Diaspora bit in my session, because what I intend to do, what I was originally planning on doing, is to bring it later in my session. But because this is something that has been designed by the Diaspora subcluster, I think I should just foreground it right away. So I will start with the a writer and a critic, which may be familiar to most of you, especially those of you who deal with diaspora studies, and that is Svetlana Boyum's fascinating book, The Future of Nostalgia. Now, in that particular book, The Future of Nostalgia, what Boyum does, she makes a really interesting distinction between two kinds of nostalgia. One is the restorative nostalgia, and the other is reflective nostalgia. Now, restorative nostalgia is something which looks back at the past, at a sort of unchanging, unmutable, organic, almost idyllic utopian past, which is sort of there as a very static entity in the subject's mind. That's the restorative bit. But the reflective nostalgia is a more interesting bit, and that's the bit that we are interested in from the perspective of memory studies. Now, according to the idea of reflective nostalgia, as studied by Boyum in that book, The Future of Nostalgia, reflective nostalgia has a process of differing and deferring, almost in a Derridian way, that the home, the idea of the home, is always slipping away. It's never really a static construct. It's always an experience, always a mutable metaphor in a certain sense. And it's a kind of nostalgia which generates something which is quite interesting. And the term that Boyum uses is diasporic intimacy, right? And that's a very, almost like oxymoronic term, because you normally associate alienation with diaspora. You normally associate defamiliarization with diaspora. But the term used by Boyum in this particular book is diasporic intimacy. And this is in connection to the idea of reflective nostalgia. So what is diasporic intimacy and how does it connect to memory studies? Now, according to that concept of diasporic intimacy, what Boyum says, again, is quite post-structuralist in the idea of memory and homeland, etc. And that is the idea of interruptions in diaspora. If you look at the idea of diaspora as an interruption, as a metonymic identity event, that your identity is never complete. The normal understanding of diaspora: you're situated somewhere else, you're desituated from your homeland, and you're constantly negotiating with the land which is not your own, and you're looking back at an idea of the original homeland, etc. Now, that interrupted entanglement is an intimate entanglement, according to Boyum, especially in relation to reflective nostalgia, because that is a site from where identities are generated, rather than from a sense of an unchanging past, right? So the negotiations, the fault lines, the contact zones of diaspora, those are the sites from which reflective nostalgia generates its own identity through diasporic intimacy. So instead of the conventional understanding of diaspora as estrangement and alienation, Boyum introduces the idea of intimacy in diaspora, how difference can actually generate a sense of identity, and which, in a very Derridian sense, looks back at the home as a constantly differed and deferred phenomenon. And she sort of ends the essay, that work, with almost a tongue-in-cheek statement, which goes on to say that homesickness, feeding this nostalgia of homesickness, can sometimes also manifest itself as being sick of home, right? So sick for home can also be sometimes sick of home, right? So homesickness, which is normally a romantic idea, you're feeling homesick, you want to go back to an original homeland, etc., can also be an annoying sentiment in certain occasions. So again, we're looking at this interesting convergence between romance and annoyance. So what that study does, The Future of Nostalgia, and again, the very title is provocative, as you can see. I mean, nostalgia as a futuristic activity. Now, what that particular work does is that it sort of, as I mentioned, it deconstructs the romantic idea of nostalgia. It deconstructs the romantic understanding of home as an unchanging ontology. and rather looks at home as an act of slippage, as an act of interruption, as an act of negotiation, whereby the diasporic construct, the diasporic location is an intimate location. And the idea of home is always a negotiation. That's the reflective nostalgia that Boehm talks about. Now, this is obviously a cultural studies understanding of memory in terms of how you look back at the past and how the past is always changing away, always slipping away, and it's never really a fixed entity. What it also does in an interesting way is that it brings in a forward-looking element into nostalgia, which is obviously evoked in the very title itself, the future of nostalgia. So nostalgia, not just as a sort of a backward-looking sentiment, also a future-looking sentiment, a forward-looking sentiment. With the associations of, let's say, aspiration, wish fulfillment, fantasy, etc. Now, the idea of fantasy and nostalgia, sort of combining these two together, is obviously a pretty radical understanding of nostalgia, remembrance, memory, etc. Now, I take this point as the nodal point in my session, and I will attempt to connect it to some of the work that we do in memory studies. So, as I mentioned, the reason why I started with Boehm's book, The Future of Nostalgia, is because I just learned from Amitabh's introduction, excellent introduction really, that the subcluster in Delhi comparatists who are organizing the session are the diaspora studies subcluster. So I thought of bringing in the idea of diasporic intimacy rather than diasporic alienation as a sort of refreshing understanding of nostalgia and how it looks at memory, not just as a backward-looking phenomenon, but also a forward-looking phenomenon, where interruptions are welcome, interruptions and absences actually generate identity. So we have an interesting relationship between interruption and identity. In other words, every identity is interrupted, and that's not always necessarily a bad thing. So that's the whole idea of diasporic intimacy, where interruption can actually generate welcome identities. And as I mentioned, homesickness can also manifest itself as being sick of home. So we have this, there's a lot of literature that I'm sure you can think about, where the idea of home as a constant nagging phenomenon can be an act of annoyance to the human subject. Oh, there is this unchanging utopian romantic home, and you're never going to go back there. So that could be a source of annoyance as well, not just romance. Anyway, so with that cultural studies perspective, let me connect to some of the works that we do in memory studies. And then I will come into the title of my lecture, this session today. It's not really a lecture, it's more of a working paper that I'm sort of working on at the moment. So I very much look forward to the feedback at the end of it. And that is the idea of the situated brain and the relationship between memory and storytelling. So again, we look at memory and storytelling both as cognitive activities, but also as cultural activities. And what I am interested in primarily is looking at the interface between cognition as a neural phenomenon, cognition as a private neural cerebral brain phenomenon, and cognition as a macro cultural phenomenon. And looking at how this interfaces connect, the interface connects to domains really of cognition. Cognition as a micro phenomenon, micro neural, and cognition as a macro extended phenomenon. Now, one very interesting connect, one very useful connect, I should say, for the purpose of this kind of research, is to look at cognition and memory as inactive modes. I'll say it again, to look at cognition and memory as inactive modes. Now, this is obviously something I'm drawing on the philosopher Andy Clark's work. Now, Andy Clark has this interesting idea of cognition, the 4 E's of cognition as he sort of formulates. And those are the embedded model of cognition, the extended model of cognition, the embodied model of cognition, and lastly, the inactive model of cognition. Now, the inactive model of cognition is the most interesting bit, especially for the purpose of this kind of research, because it looks at cognition as an activity, as a mutable activity. It's never really a static entity. It's never really a product. It's always a process of becoming, unbecoming, and rebecoming. So again, we're looking at a sort of a post-structuralist framework of cognition, if you will. And I'll sort of try to connect to some post-structuralist philosophers subsequently. Now, if you take this model of cognition, the Andy-Clark model of cognition, the inactive, embedded, extended, and embodied, what we're looking at is cognition as as an embodied phenomenon, something which happens inside the brain, inside the body, inside the nervous system, but also and equally something which extends onto the social and discursive apparatus around the subject. And this constant loop, if we will, between the inside and the outside is what constitutes cognition as an activity, as a process of becoming, unbecoming, and rebecoming all the time. Now, the other thing that Clark talks about, interestingly, and that's, I believe, is part of the title of my session, is the idea of the situated brain. Now, what does it mean by situated brain? Because, if you look at the brain as a neural machine, shall we say, as a machine of neurons firing electrochemical reactions and producing, different kinds of, impulses out of that, how is the brain situated? And Clark's argument, it takes us to a certain extent in terms of looking at how the idea of the brain connects to the idea of the mind, and by extension, the idea of the self, which is obviously a social, existential, political entity. Because, what that particular framework does, the idea of the situated brain, is it looks at the brain as a neural machine. Yes, it is a series of neurons firing different kinds of electrochemical reactions. But then again, those electrochemical reactions also produce something which is quite intangible to a certain extent, and that is emotion. And emotions obviously have a spillover effect. You're emotional about something. Emotions have an idea of sort of sense of outwards. They connect outwards to things, to events that we experience, to faces, to stimuli around us. So emotions, by the very ontological nature, they connect outwards. So the whole idea of the situated brain, again, it places the brain as an activity which is situated neurally, at the same time it is situated discursively. There's always an environment that a brain is connected to, or is trying to connect to. And there are different kinds of theories which are interesting. For example, there is a theory of ESS, External Symbolic Storage System, ESS system. So, Merlin Donald has an excellent book on this, where he talks about how the whole idea of culture for a particular subject can be seen with this particular framework, ESS, external symbolic storage, where, we have values, principles, morals, all kinds of things around us, and the subject is born into that storage system. And any act of cognition, any iteration, any performance of the subject, if you look at a subject as a performative entity, as an iterative entity, is always connecting to that idea of the ESS, the external storage system, which constitutes values and principles and political systems and discourses and whatnot. Now, what that means essentially is that we have a very interesting idea of the self, one which is neurally informed, one which is biologically informed, one which is sort of nervously informed, if I may use a cheeky phrase, but also something which is discursively determined, something which is informed by the ideology, by the discourses, by the patterns of meaning around it at any particular point of time. Now, what that immediately foregrounds is the idea of mutability, is the idea of ambivalence. And ambivalence is a very serious philosophical framework that we use in memory studies, because we look at ambivalence not as confusion. We look at ambivalence as a philosophical category where both values, values, are simultaneously articulated and accommodated. In other words, ambivalence sort of undercuts the dualistic understanding of the brain. Ambivalence undercuts the dualistic understanding of the self, and instead it becomes an articulation of ambivalence and of togetherness, of simultaneity. Right now, what that also means is the idea of fiction, the idea of literature becomes immediately interesting, because literature or fiction, if anything, becomes an instrument of ambivalence. I mean, right from the classical age down to the present day, literature has always been a sort of a machine for ambivalence, where different perspectives can come together, different nodal points can come together, and it sort of ontologically is anti-dualistic to a large extent. The medium of fiction, to a large extent, is anti-dualistic in quality. The medium of fiction can be interiorized, so we can have something like stream of consciousness, which is getting into the brain of the subject. At the same time, the medium of fiction can also be extended. It can be profoundly political, it can be distributive, it can be social, etc. And one critic, one theorist that I find extremely helpful in terms of connecting this bridge is someone called Alan Palmer. Again, I'm hoping some of you may have read his work, The Fictional Minds, fascinating work really, where he talks about the whole idea of how the mind, the human brain is essentially hardwired to be fictional. Right? Now, what does it mean by fiction? And this is something that we need to define before I proceed any further. What is the working definition of fiction that we have in memory studies? The fiction obviously is not reality. Otherwise, it will be called reality. But at the same time, fiction is not also necessarily fantasy. Fiction is not lie. It's not real. It is not lie. I mean, I'm sort of thinking of Salman Rushdie's excellent quotation where he says, "It is impossible to lie in fiction." Right. So fiction has this twilight territory between reality and possibility. So my working definition of fiction, and this is the definition that I'm drawing on for this book that I'm writing, Matter, Metaphor, Memory, is fiction is a production of possibilities. In other words, it combines what really happens or what really happened with what could have happened or what did not happen. In other words, absence becomes a very important category in fiction. What did not take place becomes important in fiction. That's why we have this interesting idea of reading between the lines. Read what is not said, read what is not articulated. And fiction is excellent in terms of smuggling in this sort of semantic possibilities between the lines. So that's the whole idea of how poetry is a more difficult medium to read rather than prose, despite its brevity. So why do people find poetry more difficult to interpret? Because more is packed into it, right? And I'm just going to come back to the idea of packed in a moment. But let me just finish with Palmer over here. So Palmer's book, Fictional Minds, is sort of a very interesting idea of how our mind, how our brains is hardwired to consume fiction. Because our brain, in a very ontological functional process, is a fictional machine. It is always situated between reality and possibility, right? Because even in terms of what we remember, we never quite remember what really happened. It is impossible for the mind or the brain to completely remember what took place. So it's always this scope of imaginative insertion. And that is something that even hardcore neuroscientists are telling us today. Someone like, for example, Eric Kandel, who's got this interesting book called Memory from Mind to Molecules. I do recommend it heavily. He says in our book, and he's a Nobel laureate in neuroscience, so it doesn't get bigger than that. He clearly mentions that every time we're remembering something, we're also simultaneously imagining something. So remembrance, by the very ontological framework, is a fluid framework, whereby reality and fantasy are entangled together in a way that becomes fictional by default, right? So Palmer's book, which is more of a philosophical work on literature and fiction, is an excellent entry point, I think, into this kind of research, which looks at the brain as a machine hardwired to consume and produce fiction. Right? Because the brain is not completely real. It doesn't know the entire reality around it. At the same time, it always has a propensity towards, fantasy. So fiction becomes this twilight territory, shall we say, between reality and fantasy. And again, if we go back to the Andy Clark idea of inactive cognition, it's always a movement between the inside and the outside. It's always a movement between what really takes place with what can take place, or what sometimes, if it's more complex, with what did not take place. Right. So as I mentioned, absence becomes a very interesting category in fiction. Now, Palmer has this very interesting idea, which I'm sort of trying to draw on as a model for this paper I'm writing. And that idea is the idea of shading, S-H-A-D-I-N-G. Now, shading, according to Palmer, is that process, that complex cognitive process through which the inside and the outside begin to merge. So the neural brain, the biological brain, and the social self begin to merge. That process is called shading by Palmer. And according to Palmer, that is a process through which the subject sort of negotiates meanings, negotiates and consumes meaning. So the negotiation and consumption of meaning in any particular social situation is done through a process of shading, which is a neural phenomenon, but equally it's a discursive phenomenon. So again, we're looking at a blend, shall we say, between the inside and the outside. And again, I mean, it's interesting to see how, and these are different critics, by the way, but it's interesting to see how Palmer's understanding of shading and Clark's understanding of situatedness are actually quite similar in a certain sense. Right, because what both people are saying, what both theorists are saying, and they're looking at it from different perspectives, entirely different perspectives, is that there's always a merge, shall we say, between the inside and the outside, between the biological brain, the neural brain, and the socially extended self. And the whole idea of enactive cognition, if you look at cognition as an enactive process, always happening in a loop, that happens through the process of shading, which situates, desituates, and resituates the subject all the time. So again, we're looking at a very Derridian vocabulary of cognition, a very post-structuralist vocabulary of cognition. And I was fascinated by the introduction of Professor Bhattacharya, where he was talking about theory, the end of theory, and how the end of theory has had such diverse reactions, and how, we can take that as a model and see how critical theory can be applied to even something as biological as cognition, which is something which is happening, by the way, in a very big way. Now, with that, let me leap into the category of absence and look at how absence as a cognitive category and how absence as a representational category can bring in neuroscience and literature in a very interesting way, which again deals with the whole idea of situationality and shading. Situationality studied by Andy Clark, and shading as studied by Alan Palmer. Again, very different focal points, but then we have a merge, a shading, ironically speaking, of different kinds of disciplines coming in together. Now, we know through empirical research today, we know through very sophisticated empirical scientific, neuroscientific research today that memory and forgetting are not really ontological opposites of each other. Rather, memory and forgetting are cognitive components of each other. In other words, if you are to remember, you must be able to forget certain things. So forgetting is not really a passive thing which happens to the brain. Forgetting is an active agentic thing that a brain does. The brain must be able to forget. So again, we're looking at forgetting as an ability, not as a pathological problem. Forgetting is something that the brain has to do in order to remember, right? And the whole idea is, if the brain does not forget certain bits of information, if the brain does not forget, it is impossible to organize information in a way which would make sense. It is impossible to organize information in a way which will make emotional sense. Not just semantic sense, but also emotional sense. So for the brain to become emotional, and there's a fascinating book that I recommend, it's called The Emotional Brain by an excellent neuroscientist called Joseph Ledoux. And again, I'll talk about Ledoux in a bit. But the whole idea of the emotional brain, for the brain to become emotional, it must be able to forget. Because, forgetting as an ability, it is connected to imagination. Because if you are not forgetting something, when you're remembering something, the imaginative component of memory begins to get undercut, begins to die away. And that can have problems, that can have serious repercussions. And interestingly, there's a very interesting story, a work of fiction, which does this, which showcases this. And I'm sure most of you have read it. It's by Borges. So Borges has a fascinating story called Funes de Memorias. And in that particular story, it's a very short story called Funes de Memorias, or Funes the Rememberer. Now, that story is about a boy who falls from a horse, has a head injury, and his medical problem is he forgets the ability to forget. In other words, he cannot forget anymore. He literally remembers everything. Now, that becomes a problem. That becomes a cognitive problem, because what it begins to show is his ability to empathize begins to die away. His ability to emote begins to die away. And there are some interesting papers written on that story, actually, which says that's actually a very good case study, that if you forget to forget, in a certain sense, your ability to empathize, empathy, emotion, these begin, other motor mechanisms, these begin to get compromised in a certain sense. Now, again, coming back to the philosophical framework that we have. So again, we're looking at forgetting and remembering as entangled activities, as ambivalent activities, not dualistic categories. So we're looking at forgetting and remembering as connected categories, as connected cognitive categories, which inform each other in a very direct cognitive sense. And there are lots of books that are writing on it. Now, like I mentioned, I just mentioned Alan Palmer and Andy Clark. I will mention two more critics, again, from very different disciplines, who use exactly the same metaphor in terms of looking at how the brain processes memory and how the brain tells stories. The first neuroscientist is Joseph Ledoux, someone I mentioned already. And the Ledoux has this excellent book. I mean, he's got a series of books. I mean, The Synaptic Self is an excellent book. The Emotional Brain is an excellent book. But he has this very interesting idea of chunking. And that, I believe, is part of the title of my session today, chunking. So what is chunking according to Ledoux, according to neuroscience? So chunking is a process through which information is encoded in the brain. Let's say we experience something, any experience. It can be a very domestic experience. It can be a violent experience. It can be a traumatic experience, a happy experience. Now, whatever the experience may be, the brain will immediately start to encode it in a trace inside the head. Now, that process of encoding will filter out certain bits and filter in certain bits. In other words, every act of encoding is a representational category because it includes inclusion and exclusion. In other words, every act of encoding must produce its own absence. And that's where forgetting starts. So forgetting actually starts at the very moment of encoding, at the very moment of memory. That's where forgetting also starts simultaneously, right? So when you're encoding something, you're also leaving out certain things simultaneously. So that idea of chunking is a very neuroscientific view offered by Joseph Ledoux in the book called Synaptic Self, where he talks about how the brain organizes information or sequences information in chunks, in meaningful units, which he calls chunks. Now, interestingly, and this is something I found out while doing research for this particular paper, the exact term chunking, is used by a cognitive narratologist called David Herman. Again, the name must be familiar to most of you. Now, Herman has got this fascinating book called Storytelling and the Sciences of the Mind, where he looks at storytelling as a neural category, but also storytelling, a neural activity, storytelling as a neural activity, and also as a cultural activity. Where Herman also uses the exact term chunking, where he says that every time you tell a story, whether it's an oral narrative, whether it's a personal story, whether it's a cultural narrative, whatever, it operates through chunking. Certain units of information are packed in together, encoded together, and also certain information is left out or abandoned. So every culture, every brain, every self will tell stories through a process of chunking. So again, we're looking at a fascinating convergence between narratology and neuroscience, right? We use the exact same metaphor of chunking. So someone like Ledoux, who's a hardcore neuroscientist, someone like Herman, who's a hardcore narratologist, who looks in stories and storytelling activities as cultural categories, using the same metaphor of chunking. In other words, putting in information, encoding information in a way that makes sense. Now, obviously, the whole idea of making sense is a contextual idea, right? So what the context consumes will make sense at any particular point of time. So let me take this convergence between neuroscience and narratology and look at how the whole idea of memory studies can be mapped onto cultural studies, right? So we're looking at, so far we're talking about largely how the brain remembers, how the brain encodes, how the brain, processes information, etc., how forgetting becomes an important activity for the brain, not as important, but also a compulsory cognitive activity to a certain extent. So let us see how this can be mapped onto cultural studies in terms of cultural memory. Now, we all know, all of us who are students of cultural studies and literature would know that every culture has its favorite memory narratives. Every nation will have its favorite memory narratives. So things which are remembered over and over again, things which are commemorated, things which are celebrated, things which are foregrounded as part of national discourse, national memory, national narrative, things which fit in any particular discursive or ideological impulse, right? That those events will be constantly replayed and remembered. Equally, every culture and every nation must be able to forget certain events. There are certain events which are never foregrounded. There are certain events which are conveniently and strategically and motivationally forgotten, right? So again, we're looking at forgetting not as an innocent, passive activity, but as a motivated activity, as something which actually happens or made to happen. Just like the brain forgets information, or the brain must forget information, even at a macro cultural level, where memory operates as a cultural narrative, forgetting must become a part of mainstream memory activity. So every nation, every culture, every demography, every ethnicity, every identity narrative must be able to produce its own oblivion. must be able to produce its own amnesia, right? So amnesia, oblivion, these become cultural categories to a large extent. And we can think of extreme examples anywhere in the world where, let us say, a brutal activity by a particular political regime is never commemorated, it's never brought back into national history or national memory because it is something which ought to be forgotten, right? So, you can think of extreme political systems where censorship or repressed knowledge operates in a way in which certain memories become forbidden memories, or certain knowledge systems become forbidden knowledge systems. It's almost illegal to remember certain things. So again, we're looking at a legality of memory in a macro level, right? So just like the brain forgets certain things in order to cope with certain mechanisms, the brain forgets certain things in order to make meanings. Even at a macro cultural level, every culture, every narrative, every nation must be able to strategically produce its own amnesic narratives, right? So again, we're looking at memory and forgetting not as ontological opposites, but as categories informing each other in a very hardcore cognitive level, but also at a sort of a cultural extended level, right? And I will just, you can think of any number of examples, any number of writers who do that. One of my favorite writers who does that consistently is Milan Kundera. So Kundera's book, for example, the Book of Laughter and Forgetting, is entirely about that, right? How certain cultures forget information, how certain identities are forgotten in a very metonymic way. Certain events, certain files, certain figures are chopped off, are dismembered from national memory, from political memory, etc. And also laughter becomes a subversive phenomenon in that kind of a political context in terms of what Kundera does. But also Kundera is interesting because Kundera brings in, especially in that particular book, the Book of Laughter and Forgetting, he brings in the idea of spectrality, which is a very important concept, the idea of spectrality. So that trace of memory, which doesn't quite go away, right? It is not material anymore, but it is still there as some kind of a haunted presence, right? It is still lingering in some kind of a haunted presence. And I find that, again, very, very Derridian and post-structuralist, especially Derrida's idea of hauntology, right? So he talks about the haunted ontology, the thing which, is there, but at the same time, not quite there. For example, those of us who read Spectres of Marx by Derrida would know, he opens the book with an allusion to Hamlet's father, right? The dead ghost, who's there at the margins of the political territory, but at the same time is not quite there. So there is a new king in Hamlet. There is Claudius at the center, but the older king, the spectral king, is still there at the margins within Denmark and Norway, still giving instructions in terms of how the politics should be carried out. And of course, the whole drama of Shakespeare is a drama of deferral. It's a very Derridian drama, Hamlet, isn't it? Where Hamlet is procrastinating, is producing procrastination, is deferring and differing all the time. So it is actually a textbook Derrida drama. That's why it's so boring, actually. It's a 5-act play where nothing happens, and in the end, everyone dies, right? Suddenly, procrastination comes to an end, and action comes, and everyone kills everyone else, and there's like a huge dead body count at the end of the stage. But the whole idea of Hamlet as a spectral phenomenon, as a theater of spectrality, is interesting. Is interesting because it talks about the whole spectral phenomenon of politics, and that's how memory and forgetting they don't become ontological opposites. So for example, older Hamlet is not quite forgotten; it's still quite there, but at the same time he's getting haunted over and over again. So again, we're looking at shading and haunted ontology as important and interesting activities at a cultural level, at the same time at a cognitive level. So I'll just stop at this point today. Like you said, it's a work in progress. It's a working paper that I'm doing at the moment, and I'm very open to any questions and feedback that the audience may have. Thank you for your attention.
Indeed, it's a wonderful talk. I don't know how to react right at this moment, but there are so many points that Dr. Parui has so wonderfully demonstrated. And I was talking about, I was making a simple point only, that the emergent possibilities of our various disciplines will be taken care of, and it has indeed been taken care of. But I would not lose any more time. I would request, I think Amitabh is not looking after that. It is, if there are any questions, we will be, which have been
Yes, sir,
in the meantime. So this, yeah. So beautiful. If there are any questions, put it straight to the speaker.
Yeah. Thank you so much, sir. I can see one question in the chat box from Lakshmi, and she asks that, can you distinguish between history and cultural memory?
Yes, it's an excellent question. I mean, history obviously is an act of writing memory, right? So, for example, the way it is written, it always has a certain focal point, it has a certain perspective, which is more often than not the hegemonic perspective, which informs history. So again, we can go back to the idea of the very neural understanding of memory, which operates through three phases, broadly speaking. The first phase is encoding, the second phase is consolidation, and the third phase is retrieval. So history is a process of consolidation, but at the same time, it's a privileged consolidation. It's a privileged consolidation of a privileged encoding model, right? So only certain bits get into that particular model, which is, again, mutable, by the way. It can change the valences all the time. So that's the reason why some people are suddenly resurrected in historical history textbooks. Some good people become bad people, and bad people become good people, depending on a particular cultural, political climate. Because, as I mentioned, the process of encoding is a very selective process, and it is always connected to the discourse, the ideological impulse around that particular time. Now, collective memory can sometimes be notoriously incompatible with history, right? Because what a collective remembers, what a particular group remembers, may not be represented at all in history. If you consider history as a textualization of memory, if you look at history as a materialization of memory, right? That process of materializing memory is a privileged process to a large extent, because it enters the discourse apparatus in terms of books, in terms of monuments, in terms of archives, in terms of museums. And these are very privileged institutions. These are very privileged markers of memory, which may have almost nothing to do with collective memory at all. And, you know, there's a series of literature on that. For example, very close to home, we can look at the literature of partition, especially Manto's writing, which talks about how the historical narrative and a collective memory narrative can be completely incompatible with each other, right? The Toba takes thing is a very good case in point. So yeah, that's an excellent question. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. There's another question from Yasmina. She asks for, could you elaborate more on the idea of spectrality and its connection to trauma?
Yes, I mean, spectrality obviously is a critical theory term that I'm using. The idea is something which doesn't quite go away, and it is quite closely connected to trauma. So that's an excellent question, because the whole idea of spectrality has to do with repeatability. So the specter will always keep coming back. And as a classic definition of trauma, as an act of repetition, it keeps coming back at different points of time. Now, one interesting philosopher or critic that I find helpful in terms of looking at the idea of forgetting, trauma, and spectrality is someone called Marc Auge, M-A-R-C-A-U-G-E, a French philosopher. It's got this interesting work called Oblivion. Now, in that particular book, Oblivion, Auge talks about how forgetting can become a resistance towards that kind of a reputation, right? How the brain or the subject or a collective, even a collective group, can refuse to remember a certain event because it is too traumatic in quality, right? So forgetting can sometimes become a political process. Forgetting can sometimes become a sort of a manipulated process where a certain group decides to forget, decides to unremember a certain event or de-remember a certain event, right? So spectrality is a very interesting term because it is, like you mentioned, the whole idea of shading, the whole idea of situationality. It is something situated between reality and fantasy. It is something situated between appearance and disappearance. But it is this liminal quality about spectrality, which makes it very, very interesting for memory studies. And it's very closely connected to trauma because of its repeatability, the whole idea of something which keeps coming back as a specter, doesn't quite go away, doesn't quite completely disappear. That becomes very closely connected to trauma studies, especially in a Freudian sense. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Our next question is from Shutonuka. She asks for, how do you perceive collective memory and the idea of nostalgia and home for nomadic groups?
Yes, I mean, obviously, it's a very complex question because it depends on the situationality of that particular group. Every nomadic group, every diasporic community will have its own stories, will have its own unique memories, will have its own unique traumas, will have its own unique absences. And I think as students of memory studies, we need to take a look at absences very seriously. What are the stories which don't get told, right? So those are stories which need to be resurrected, because, in connection with the first question that I had, which is about history and collective memory. So in terms of any nomadic group, the whole idea of collective memory becomes interesting, because the stories which get told and the stories which don't get told become very, very interesting and very, very important, because those need to be connected. So again, at a theoretical, philosophical level, we need to take a look at absences very, very seriously in memory studies. And this is where literature comes in very interestingly, because literature, as I mentioned, the working definition of fiction is a production of possibilities. Things which happened and things which did not happen, and things which could have happened and things which should have happened, right? So I think fiction becomes a very potent medium to look at in terms of understanding all nomadic experiences, especially experiences of alienation, trauma, etc. Just to go back to the beginning of my session, where I talk about how, especially in Svetlana Boym's work, The Future Nostalgia, we need to take a look at nostalgia, not necessarily as a romantic activity, not necessarily as something which wants to go back in the past, but also a futuristic activity, something which shapes the future. And again, at a technical level, this connects to a technical understanding of memory, because in memory studies, or in memory as a psychological activity, there are two different kinds of memory that are simultaneously operative. And one is retrospective memory, and the other is prospective memory. So there's also a memory which shapes our future action. There's also a memory which shapes how we perceive the past, perceive the present in terms of how it becomes the future, right? And that can happen at a very motor level. For example, learning to swim, for example. If you learn to swim once, you'll always be able to swim. So the moment you're inside a swimming pool or a sea, you will begin to swim, because that memory will shape your future action. But also at a collective cultural level, prospective memory is very, very interesting, especially in relation to nomadic experiences, I think. So not just in terms of looking back at the past, in terms of an unchanging entity, but also looking at the past as a mutable experiential category, which can shape the discourse of the future. So that would be my response. But it's an excellent question. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Our next question is from Orko. He asked, do you think the notion of memory based on absence that opens fictional possibilities can talk back to the emotional brain and notions of disaffection and cool psyche in Malibu, which may be relevant for Funes?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I should have mentioned Malibu in my session. I mean, she is a key figure in terms of looking at a post-structuralist understanding of memory, trauma, etc. I mean, there's a series of books that she's written. I'm sure most of us are aware of it. The Ontology of the Accident, for example. She's got a book on neuroplasticity, plasticity at dusk. Again, the notion of plasticity, not just as a neural phenomenon, but also as an epistemic phenomenon, right? So how does a subject experience an event post-trauma, right? So the plasticity which changes the experience of experience. So that's metacognitive quality of plasticity. So yes, the whole idea of disaffection becomes interesting, and Malibu becomes a very, very key figure in terms of a bridge between hardcore critical theory, the Derridan kind, and trauma studies and cognitive studies. So yeah, Malibu would be an excellent entry point. I would recommend that. Thank you.
Sir, now if I may ask a question,
Sure.
as you are talking about like forgetting and the absence, so can we say that memory acts as palimpsest, like it has a palimpsestic features, because sometimes we need to like redo the past with new information so that we can like move on in life or something. Otherwise, as you said, like forgetting is not an innocent activity, but it's like a quality of a person or quality of an individual. So can we say that this memory acts as palimpsest?
Absolutely. I mean, it's an excellent metaphor, because the whole process of memory needs to be looked at as a textual activity, and anything which is a text can be rewritten, as you very correctly pointed out. So the whole idea of a textuality of something is something that can be reshaped, something which can be deconstructed. And as you all know, anything which can be deconstructed can be reconstructed. So memory as a mutable process is something, and again, this connects to the idea of Andy Clark's concept of inactive cognition. right? A constant loop between the inside and the outside, which is happening all the time, where memory and forgetting, absences and presences, materialization and disappearance simultaneously, sort of working together. But, in terms of a more technical response to your question, the whole idea of memory as a, palimpsest-like quality, again, we need to take a look at memory and forgetting not as ontological opposites, even at a hardcore cognitive level, because there is a concept called memory-induced forgetting in hardcore neuroscience, and which says that if, let's say, you are giving a trigger to a particular subject to remember something, now that particular subject, the brain, must be able to forget certain other associated things in order to remember that particular thing. Let us say you're giving 4 different colors to a particular subject and asking that subject to remember one particular color. So the brain must be able to forget the other 3 colors in order to retrieve that one correct color. So again, at a very hardcore neural level, I'm sorry if this sounds boring, but even at a very hardcore neural level, memory and forgetting, they induce each other, right? So we have this concept called memory-induced forgetting. In other words, if you are to retrieve a certain information, you must be able to unremember certain related information for that information to come back. And that's a classical textual thing, isn't it? For a particular text to be encoded, certain other text must be de-encoded, filtered away, right? So we're looking at chunking as a concept. We're looking at, shading as a concept, which are all very, very textual concepts, I think. So yes, the metaphor of palimpsest is fantastic, and it goes perfectly well with memory studies. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. So our next question is, in terms of psychological experiences of diaspora, is there any negative impact of intergroup contact on the ethnic identity of people?
Yes, I mean, those are very, very extreme, violent, ethnographic experiences where conflict can generate a disintegration of identity, right? I mean, we have several examples, Bosnia, Palestine, I mean, several examples across the world where that kind of a conflict zone can disintegrate sort of identity, not just at a collective level, but also at a neural level, also at a very experiential level, where the subject's intimate understanding of identity gets interrupted permanently. And this, in a way, connects to the idea of the ontology of the accident that Malibu talks about. So if you treat those conflicts as accidents in a philosophical framework, then the subject's understanding of his own identity becomes interrupted in such a way that doesn't become recoverable at all. So, in connection with the question, my answer would be yes. In extreme situations of conflict, of violence, of trauma, the whole meaning-making mechanism of the subject, which is a neural mechanism as well as a discursive mechanism, that gets interrupted in such a way that it just becomes unrecoverable, except through fantasy, perhaps. So, you find that in those kind of situations, the most popular literary genre becomes magic realism, which offers a fantasy escape to a certain extent, because the reality is so broken, the reality is so fragmented, that it's impossible to create literature out of it. So we have revisions of epics, we have revisions of myths, we have revisions of fantasy, but fantasy becomes the only instrument of storytelling on those situations. So yeah, that's a very good question. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Our next question is, can we say that memory or imagination can be a source of truth compared to history, especially that history is full of gaps, silences, and lacks? Can imagination substitute history for knowing or accessing the past?
Yeah, I would say fiction can be a very potent instrument. I mean, just the reason why we look at fiction so seriously. And that's also the reason why we find that fiction books get banned more often than history books. Right. Why would you ban a novel, for example? If you want to ban something, ban a history book. But how many of us have heard of history books being banned? I mean, perhaps there have been history books. I don't know. Maybe I'm ignorant. But we can think of a dozen novels which have been banned right away. Right. So the question is, at a very ontological level, fiction is not claiming to be true. So why ban it? Right. And that the reason why it is banned, because it gives not just an effective understanding of history, it also gives an affective understanding of history. And affect can be subversive, affect can be political, affect can be dangerous. So I think what we need to do at a very hardcore cognitive level is to welcome this entanglement between effective narrative and affective narrative. And that's where memory studies come in a very interesting way. So yes, that would be my response. The whole understanding of emotional memory becomes interesting. And also see, the whole idea of emotions has always been marginalized as a secondary epistemic category, right? Reason has always been the primary epistemic category, and it is not difficult to see how this is very gendered as well, how reason has always been male, emotions always been female, and that kind of a politics of, categorization and hierarchy has been operative even in terms of narrative. So emotional narratives are to be less trusted because they're emotional, and reasonable historical narratives are to be more trusted because they're reasonable. But we know, obviously through years of critical theory, we know that the whole idea of reason is a fantastic construct. And I use the word fantastic quite literally. It's a construct of fantasy. And more often than not, white male fantasy. Yes.
Thank you, sir. Our next question is, to what extent can we consider autobiographical writing and testimonial literature as part of fiction?
Yes, there's an interesting neuroscientist that I maybe should have recommended, but because autobiography came in, I remembered. How ironical. There's a person called Michael Huizinga, I think. Michael Huizinga. It's so ironical if you forget something in a memory studies session. But anyway, so if you look up Michael Huizinga, he talks about, he's a very, very respected neuroscientist, but he talks about how the whole idea of memory, the whole idea of autobiography is fiction, and we must treat autobiography as fiction, because again, we're looking at fiction as a liminal landscape between sort of reality and fantasy, and that's how the brain operates anyway, right? So you already have a medium that can best represent the brain, and that is fiction, right? And my favorite example of that is Rollebart's autobiography called Rollabart by Rollabart, right? Where the very opening page says that this should be treated as a work of fiction, right? Which means that this is the closest to the truth, because truth is fiction, because the way we consume truth is always through half understanding and half knowledge. It's never really a complete process. So any claim of completion is always a fantastic claim. So I think the acknowledgement of the fictional quality of truth is a very honest acknowledgement, and autobiography at best should be read as a fictional representation. And this connects to the idea of memory as a story that the brain tells to the self, right? So if you consider memory as a story that a brain tells to the self, to make meaning, to consume meaning, to sustain meaning, so autobiography becomes something that we already do, neurally speaking. So every second we are telling, the brain is telling a story to itself. That's how we have a sense of the self. That is how we make sense of ourselves, because the brain is always telling us stories. Because if you consider encoding as storytelling, that every experience that we see around us is converted into a trace. And if you consider trace as a narrative, what happens essentially is the brain is constantly producing stories. And our sense of self is an act of consumption of stories that come from the brain. I don't know if this is an extreme or scary metaphor, but that's a handy metaphor, I think.
Thank you so much, sir. Amitabh, would you like to share some observations of yours?
No, maybe because I'm convener, you are saying, would you like?
I think he just muted himself. No,
Yeah. You might, already that you are dealing with a group of audience, which is given our disciplinary background that we do literature. We are always in this trap because we are not adopting, we don't adopt Russian.
I think he's getting muted again, isn't it?
Because we are not taking a Russian formalists' understanding of literary studies. So we don't limit ourselves to only studying form and content, which we can deal easily, but we always need other disciplines to interact with other disciplines. What we have been dealing with so far was philosophy and sociology. Because the most important part that the brain, or say mind, which is linked to literature, has not been accessible to us in recorded form for such a long time. Now, neuroscience has brought in this change. It is recording what we call mind or brain. So it's a new moment for a lot of us. So I really would think that in future, maybe we can have more teaching sessions from your end on this. While listening to your lecture, these are, I think my voice is breaking, but anyway, these are not always a question. You see, I was remembering, I taught a memoir a few years back. It's most probably her name is Beaton, but she, after the death of her husband, she wrote how she went through that trauma for 1 year, and also when her daughter was unwell. And there you see in an autobiography where she talks about how slowly she comes back out of grief through forgetting and through finding where that her memory, what her memory is producing as the presence of her husband is no more as impactful as it was in the beginning. From the literature, I also find two interesting aspects of absences and creations, like in Uttar Ramacharita, when the illusionary Sita is being brought. This is a very interesting moment for, if we look at again from memory. But when you come to Jayadeva's Gita Govindam, when he says, Yadi Harismarane Sarasang Mano, Yadi Vilasa Kalas Kutuhalam. Now, what would that mind, which would be reading this text, how would that mind put both of these together in relationship to absences and presences at certain points? Now, these are things which I think the students of literature can explore, unless those who are getting themselves trained into neurosciences. When you have talked about situated brain, I was wondering, what is the take of those who are working from the perspective of evolution? What is the evolutionists, what are they doing? And second is, when you talk of this encoding every moment and that the absence is an essence of encoding, I was reminded of the basic principle that Saussure came up with when he talked about the feature of language, which has been used in two different ways by structuralists and post-structuralists. So has there been works from linguists or neurologists on this particular thesis? Because if you talk about this encoding as essentially a presence which also requires absence, where presence and absence are linked together integrally, then I think Saussure's idea of language gets a validation from empirical sciences. And then it becomes more interesting for us. I mean, these are a few stray ideas that came up when listening to you. Over to you.
Yeah, okay. No, these are excellent. I mean, I agree with almost everything that you said. I mean, I just go back to the understanding of the Russian formalists that you mentioned, and maybe I should have mentioned Todorov and Bakhtin, two very key figures in memory studies. I mean, Todorov has this very interesting essay where he talks about how every narrative must proceed through effacement and consolidation, right? So every narrative must produce its own effacement. So I mean, he talks about folk narratives, he talks about the structural narratives, which connects to your understanding of Saussure as well. So yeah, Todorov has a direct essay on this, where effacement and consolidation are simultaneous activities in a way that memory and forgetting are. And Bakhtin has a fascinating metaphor that I use. I find that a very, very useful metaphor for memory studies, the metaphor of the chronotop. The whole idea of the space and time put together, which is mutable, which is experiential, which is ontological, which is affective as well. But then the whole idea of a sort of an Einsteinian understanding of space and time as vectors informing each other, rather than as a fixed geopolitical entity, right? So the chronotop is something which is experiential, where space and time merge together. Because at a very fundamental cognitive level, when we remember something, we don't remember a space or a time, we remember a space and a time together, right? So the chronotop becomes a perfect metaphor for memory. So Bakhtin is a definite figure, I think, for any understanding of memory. Now, your allusions from the classical literature is fascinating, and I'm not a scholar of that, so I look forward to learning that from you later, perhaps an email exchange where you can give me some references. But just coming back to the idea of the linguists and the evolutionary psychologists, Merlin Donald has a very interesting take. I think I mentioned him at some point, Merlin Donald, where he talks about the whole idea of the evolutionary brain, the situated brain, and how obviously the neural encoding is obviously an evolutionary pattern. So the whole idea of encoding or engram. So engram is the term used by psychologists where, that encoded information inside the brain, that particular unit of information. But Merlin Donald takes it a step further and comes with a term called xgram, where he says that, even at a cultural level, even at a sort of sociological, cultural, evolutionary level, we have the units of information which can become values, which can become morals, which can become principles. But there are these condensed units of information which happen in any particular culture. And that act of condensation and consolidation at a neural level, engram, at a sociological level, xgram, is exactly the way the subject operates. Right, in a very embedded process, and also at an inactive, extended evolutionary process. Now, I think in terms of a linguistic understanding of cognition, Oliver Sacks is a very good person to go to. I'm sure most of you have read his works in terms of how, he talks about language and cognition, and also the whole idea of storytelling and cognition, how at a very embedded level, at a very hardcore cognitive level, and we are hardwired to tell stories through language. So language is a storytelling mechanism. So the whole idea of a linguistic understanding of cognition is how we can use language to tell stories, and that is something that even someone like Antonio Damasio talks about, where he says that we are hardwired, neurally speaking, to tell stories. We are storytelling animals. That's how we evolved as a primate, right? And that's how we've evolved ahead of other primates, that we have managed to create stories, we have managed to consume stories. And some stories have become religion, some stories have become science, some stories have become culture, but we've essentially evolved through storytelling, right? And one philosopher that I find very interesting at a macro level is Zoan Huizinga, who's got this fascinating book called Homo Ludens. And again, I'm sure some of you have heard it, read it. So, the whole idea of man, the playful animal, the whole idea of culture as a playful activity, that we create these plays around us, we create the games around us, and we've evolved through different rituals of playing, to different rituals of storytelling and story consumption. So yes, at a macro level, all that is said, it makes perfect sense in terms of how, linguistically speaking, we evolved to storytelling. We have remembered through language. So language is an embedded phenomenon. So for example, when a child is born in a particular language system, so he or she would consume that system, neurally speaking, pick up the language. But at the same time, if that child is a clever child, intelligent child, cognitively able or competent child, very soon he or she will be able to play with that system in terms of telling stories, telling lies, fabricating, fabulating, right? So language becomes a very important instrument in terms of how memory has evolved through sort of intergenerational process. So yeah, these are excellent observations. Thank you very much, Amitabh. But I look forward to learning more from you in terms of the allusions that you gave, because I haven't read those works, and I look forward to perhaps emailing you and getting some references, if that's okay with you.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. I mean, in fact, our chair is an expert on Sanskrit literature as well. So
Brilliant, brilliant.
we
I look
can
forward to
expect
learning from
some
you.
points from him as well.
Definitely, sir. I look forward to learning from you, sir.
Thank you so much, sir, for taking up questions and for your remarks and comments. If I may now request Tapodhir, sir, for his concluding remarks, please.
I think it's muted.
Sure, after such a wonderful discourse of multiple dimensions, I don't really know that any conclusion is ever possible. There might not be any conclusion anywhere. But I was very keenly listening to whatever Dr. Parui has been telling us, and also the questions that were put to him, and he very aptly responded to all of them. All of these have been very excruciating stuff. But there are some questions, but I would reserve my judgment right now, because it is I think it is not advisable to say anything without going much into much details about everything. But whatever the things that I have noted, Dr. Parui, for my own, I don't know whether it will be beneficial for me. Number one is the way you have discussed the absences. In my own way, I was also a student of literature and in general and literary theory in particular. Uh, I have tried to comprehend the multiple dimensions of the absences which are hidden in the texts. And like true explorers, we are asked or we are required to decipher those absences. These are very, very important. But the way you have been talking about the dialogics of, I'm using a Bakhtinian term, you understand, the dialogics of memory and forgetting. I was just wondering whether memory is an ontological privilege of all of us, we who are human beings. But then, after listening to you, I was wondering whether amnesia at the collective level and forgetting at the individual level might not be that bad also, because it has a new dialogues of its own. And thirdly, the way you have forward, well, this is a territory where I will not venture into, but I am aware that even when I was a student of semiotics as well, so I was really surprised. And when I came to know that even the biosciences are putting new materials into the arena of semiotics, which originated, as you know, from the time of Socrates. So the thing is that we are now at the edge of everything, because so many things are intermingling, and it is posing many questions also. Number one question is, it's no doubt, but I am putting question to myself only. All of us who are present here are only overhearing perhaps, that whether that would ultimately land into a not that much agreeable position where the subtle understanding of literature in the multiple human universe would become exclusive privilege for only a very selected few. So there might be, I don't know what will happen, because I don't like to be a soothsayer, but there might be a possibility which is not really very enjoyable, when if on the one hand you are thinking of making literature accessible to all, but then the true understanding of literature is never going to be accessible to everybody. Will be always be the privilege of a selected few. I don't know whether it's going to put more complexities into the arena, or it will be opening up new territories. And another one, when you are talking at the almost at the end part of your discourse, Dr. Parui, and I was wondering within myself whether, because you put it in such a nice way that, well, that sometimes we lose certain territories in our understanding. Then there is another uh, possibility of reterritorializing everything. First, you lose something, and then you regain it again. There is another dialogics. I will be excused if I use Deveshraya's Bengali only two words. So I may be excused. Punar Biroho এবং পুনর্মিলন means you are losing certain things at one end, but you regain it at another level. So this is what all is literature about. And Dr. Parui is traversing on it might be a difficult terrain for me, but nevertheless, it is definitely opening up new vistas of possibilities for not only literature, but all human endeavors, perhaps. So there are many other things, but I would not try to vex you with my words. But I'm sure I'll be looking forward to read your book. I have, when Amitabh told me through WhatsApp, and I became immediately interested. Because you see, we human beings have a tendency, very old tendency, not very praiseworthy though, that we try to divide everything into very well-made territories, and necessarily some frontiers are being erected. This is not necessary. And what you are trying now, you are trying to deconstruct everything, and I hail you for that. You are trying to dismantle all the frontiers, and that is what is needed perhaps in the forthcoming third decade and beyond of the 21st century. So with these words, I once again thank you, Dr. Parui, and I assure you, I would listen to the recording of today's deliberation again and again, and this will benefit me. Everybody is after his own interest only, so I am no different in that. And I am sure that every moment is a learning moment for me. Though you are much, much younger to me, but then one learns from the younger ones because you have your new perception, and that new perception I always hail. Thank you, Dr. Parui. I wish you all the best in all your academic endeavors henceforth. Thanks.
Thank you so much, sir. That is so overwhelming and humbling coming from you. I really, really appreciate that. And I look forward to exchanging emails with you and perhaps interacting with you in the future and learning from you, as I'm sure I will. Thank you so much for those very kind words. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tapodhir sir and Abhishek sir. Now I would like Amitabh to close the event with your comments. Thank you.
Okay, there is no this is not a formal thanks note. Abhishek, while going through, I was just reminded, which I'll like to share with the group and also particularly with Abhishek. Around 2010, I was presenting and trying to propagate a new sort of concept, depending primarily on Russian formalism. I was talking about a neo-formalism, because that was the time when I started reading about neuroaesthetics and found that this was the time which is a new turning point for us, those who are trying to do literary studies or dealing with the basic questions of aesthetics and literature. Because through those studies, I mean, if we say take these examples, say up to before Pierre Bourdieu, the basic features of literature were being dealt with through verbal argumentation, where the empirical data would be basically dependent on how much one has read of literature. And with Pierre Bourdieu, there is a shift where the basic questions are being dealt based on sociological method of surveying and then producing the survey results to us. But even then, that was the point. We didn't have the reply to quite a few questions. For example, Bourdieu comes up with the fact that there is a link between the class divide and the choice of high and low literature. But he doesn't have the explanatory method to explain how it is related. Then comes neuroscientific studies, which primarily actually concentrated on visual. Sorry. So there were a lot of studies on painting and where they tried to understand what happens in our brain when we watch or see something which you consider to be good or bad. Now, this is the domain where we will be able to find through experiment and through machine-based observations responses to a few of our questions with which we have been dealing for centuries. And hence, this becomes very important that we start doing it. The fact that you have already started doing it, you have actually, you are in a project, and that means, I mean, in front of when my professor is present here, I cannot bring in my age, but I would like to do that. Yeah, at certain points, I really feel that I don't have anymore the energy to go into it, and I would have loved to do it. But maybe through collaborative works, we can do it. So I'll have a request to you, Abhishek, if we can actually work together, Delhi Comparatist and your institute, so that we can learn. And also, as I told you, that, you know, there are new things which will come up. If you look at the Sanskrit Vaishnava poetics and presence and absence, that would be I think I already am so fascinated by this, how we can deal with it. So thanks a lot. I think we'll invite you again to deal with a few basic things to which we have not been exposed yet. It is always preferable to listen to a lecture rather than going through all papers. I mean, apart from going through papers. Thanks a lot, Abhishek.
Thank you. Just a very quick response to the last pragmatic bit, Amitabh. We have a research network on memory studies in IIT-Madras, and I would very much like Delhi Comparativist to be a part of it. So if I could just email Shrimoyee, because I've been emailing her, she's been a point of contact for me, and I'll be very, very keen to rope you all in a collaborative framework. I mean, we also have a WhatsApp group. We can talk about these details later, but we're looking for collaborators. And I think your expertise in Sanskrit and also Professor Bhattacharya's expertise in Sanskrit literature will be a huge benefit for us in terms of how we can reread those texts using current memory studies lens. So I will be in touch with you very, very shortly. Thank you.
Thank you. The chairperson, Professor Tapodhir Bhattacharya, I can't thank him. He's my teacher. So he is the one who taught in our classrooms that you never have to limit yourself. You have to go beyond what you have been taught or what you have inherited so far. So in a way, whatever I am today is because of his teaching. So pranam, sir. And I thank everyone who has participated in this webinar. If those who are not already associated with Delhi Comparatist would like to get update whenever we organize a webinar, please post your email ID in the chat box, and we will surely forward you, because as I can say, we are also having very interesting projects, particularly COVID-19 cultural responses project and literary historiography looking differently and digital humanities. So thank you all. With your permission, I'll now close this session. I'll leave it open for a few moments so that you can post your email IDs, others can. But thank you, Abhishek, and I'm closing the meeting.
Thank you. Thank you. I'll take your leave now, and I look forward to the YouTube link later. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you.